Today, a busy road connects the Gulf Coast with Masjid Suleiman, a small market town which also lies at the center of large oil fields. Since antiquity, oil and gas sputtered to the earth's surface here. When oil bubbled here 100 years ago, great hopes were attached to it. Above all, William Knox Darcy, a speculator and adventurer who had made a fortune with gold mines in Australia. When Shah Muzaffar al-Din offered him a concession for black gold in Persia, he jumped at the opportunity. The Shah was in desperate need of money, and in 1901 sold the Englishman an oil concession for £40,000. He spent huge amounts of money on his extensive luxury travels to Europe. In 1902, the traces of black gold in the Valley of Oil lured English oil investors to the remote and barren Karst mountain range. Mules and camels had to haul tools and building materials from the coast to the heart of the province Khuzestan. Blistering heat, lack of water, and the hostility of the local nomads couldn't discourage the oil pioneers. Head of the English expedition was the tough, legendary Scottish engineer George Reynolds. The first oil rigs built with primitive means only yielded disappointments. For years, no profitable oil well was struck.
In 1908, crude oil was discovered in Iran. Winston Churchill, Britain's civilian head of the Royal Navy, was convinced that oil, not coal, was the fuel of the future. In 1909, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company was formed to develop the new industry.
Everybody knew that sooner or later they were going to find oil across the border in what was then Ottoman Iraq. British investments increased, British presence increased, and already there were well-detailed plans to conquer at least the southern part of the country prior to World War I.
Great Britain saw her power threatened by the German Reich, which challenged the Navy with a fleet of battleships. Winston Churchill, at the time First Lord of the Admiralty, pressed for the English dreadnoughts to be converted from coal to oil combustion. In future, the ships had to be faster than the Germans, which ran on coal. In Istanbul, the Germans belatedly joined the race for oil. Turkey asked the friendly German Reich for the construction of the Baghdad Railroad, so she could access her Arabian province, Mesopotamia. Later, it was to be built all the way to Basra at the Persian Gulf. In Mesopotamia, the later Iraq, one expected to find rich oil resources. The Kaiser, who had himself portrayed in an Ottoman Pasha uniform, gave top priority to the construction of the railroad. The satirical newspaper, the Lustigen Blätter, ridiculed the imperialistic project, paved the way for German cultural activities in the Orient. German financial interest for the project was never publicly disclosed. Only when the Kaiser exerted pressure did the Deutsche Bank agree to provide financing. Despite enormous technical difficulties, the construction of the railroad made good progress. London was concerned. She considered the Mid-East region to be part of the British sphere of interests, from which she could secure access to the gateway to India. In Persia, the English were faster. With the help of only a single pipeline, they were able to transport the oil from Masjid Suleiman to the coast. Over a stretch of 200 kilometers, the pipes had to be laid through two rocky, hilly ranges and a broad desert plain. As roads, lines and bridges were non-existent, this could almost only be achieved by sheer muscle power and with the help of thousands of horses, mules and camels. Only in the more flat terrain, tractors could be used. In the summer of 1912, after 1.5 years, the pipeline reached Abadan, where the first loading port and the first refinery on the Persian Gulf were constructed. Oil could now set out to conquer the world, just in time to play a major role in World War I.
On August 1st, 1914, Germany, motivated by a desire for greater power and international influence, declared war on Russia. World War I was set in motion. When the Ottoman Empire sided with Germany and Austria-Hungary against the Allies, the British found their commercial interests in the Middle East suddenly threatened. By November 1914, the British Army occupied Basra to defend the Anglo-Persian Oil Company's fields and refineries nearby in Iran. Beginning in 1916, the British engaged in a series of offenses that eventually led to the capture of Baghdad. They entered the city on March 11, 1917, under Lieutenant General Sir Frederick Stanley Maude. General Maude announced to the people of Baghdad,
"Our armies do not come into your cities and lands as conquerors or enemies, but as liberators."
The British Army continued to move north until it captured Mosul early in November 1918. Britain then controlled nearly all of Iraq. The Ottoman Turks were defeated.
Oil was the blood of victory. At first at sea, where the German coal-fueled fleet was inferior to the British fleet. Now the British were determined to also bring the oil fields of Mesopotamia under their control. France pursued the same goal in the part of Mesopotamia she had conquered. In London, Prime Minister Clemenceau met his colleague Lloyd George to discuss their respective interests. Both aspired a mandate by the League of Nations in Geneva for their part of the former Turkish province, for Syria and for Iraq. As both had already shown military presence in the region, the League of Nations agreed. It was the beginning of Part 2 of European oil imperialism. The British assigned an exceptional woman, Gertrude Bell, to fulfill the League of Nations mission to build up a sovereign state in Iraq during the time of the mandate. An expert on the Orient out of Passion, who spoke perfect Arabic, she was present at all high-level talks, also participating in the discussions about border issues with the Saudi king Ibn Saud. At a conference in Cairo, she convinced the new British Secretary of State for the Colonies, Churchill, to withdraw from direct rule in Baghdad and agree to the establishment of a monarchy. The Khatun, the lady, was trusted by the sheiks, as she knew better than they where the borders of their clan territory ran. In a modest tone, she wrote to her mother on the 4th of December, 1921.
One way or another, I think I've succeeded in compiling a reasonable frontier.
Arnold Wilson was the administrator in charge of the Iraq Mandate.
He argued that it was in British interest to bring civilization to Iraq, to Mesopotamia, and that this could only be done through direct English rule over the country. Thus, he brushed aside any claims of Iraqis to participate in the governance of the country.
Iraqis and Arabs from other Ottoman provinces in the Middle East hoped their long-held dream of self-rule would finally come true.
An Arab nationalist movement of sorts had already started before World War I. And many of the Arab army officers and civil servants and intellectuals who had been, some of them educated in Istanbul, were opposed to...
Enraged at being shut out of the new government, 100,000 armed Iraqis revolted in July 1920.
In the Iraqi view, of course, this is the first national rebellion against British colonialism.
It took the British 3 months to crush the rebellion. By 1921, Colonial Secretary Winston Churchill was determined to end direct British rule and install a British-friendly Arab leader as King of Iraq. He invited Prince Faisal al-Hussein to become ruler of the new state, even though he was not Iraqi, but was instead a member of the Hashemites, the ruling family of Mecca.
Faisal was a descendant of the Prophet, and thus he had sort of religious credentials. He had Arab nationalist credentials in the sense that he was a leader of a revolt against the Ottomans in the name of Arabism. Generally speaking, he was considered to be quite moderate and willing to accommodate British interest.
In August 1921, Faisal was elected King of Iraq in a dubious referendum. The Hashemite monarchy was considered as foreign by many Iraqis.
The real problem here was the monarchy was seen as sort of a tool of the British.
The Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which since 1914 also had a holding in the Turkish Oil Company, was now in charge. She accepted the French as the heirs to the German interest, but no American oil companies. Washington was up in arms against the British monopoly and demanded its own concession for Standard Oil as an alternative. Due to British pressure, Baghdad denied this request. Alan Dulles, the Near East representative at the State Department at the time, was a particularly persuasive advocate of an open-door policy. In the end, London yielded in favor of Standard Oil and its ruthless president Teagle. It needed American funds for the development of the Iraqi oil fields. Standard Oil took over the leadership of an American consortium, which was given a holding of almost 24%. The newly founded Iraq Oil Company was made up of 5 partners. The negotiations were only completed a few days before oil gushed out of the first oil well in Baba Gurgur near Kirkuk. The British interests in Iraq were now administered by King Faisal I, who, after his coronation, was received by King George VI in London. As a Sunni Muslim and a member of the Hashemite dynasty, which had been expelled from Saudi Arabia, Faisal was disliked by many Iraqis, especially by the Shiites. He was regarded as a minion of the English oil imperialists, who could only rule with their military assistance.